Everything you learned about when humans first arrived in the Americas. Probably wrong. A team of archaeologists just found stone tools and ancient campfire remains in a cave in Oregon that date back over 18,000 years. That's thousands of years before humans were supposedly even on this continent. The textbooks need to be rewritten, and this discovery changes everything we thought we knew about how the Americas were populated. Let's dive into what they found, and why it's blowing everyone's minds. First, let's talk about what we thought we knew. The standard story went like this. Around 13,000 years ago, during the last ice age, humans crossed from Siberia into Alaska over the Bering Land Bridge. This wasn't actually a bridge, more like a massive stretch of exposed land that connected Asia to North America when sea levels were lower. Then migrated south through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers covering Canada. They spread across North and South America, hunting mammoths and giant sloths, and became the ancestors of all Native American peoples. Simple story. Clean timeline. Everyone agreed on it for about 50 years. Except it was wrong. Dead wrong. The first cracks in the Clovis first theory started appearing in the 1970s and 80s. Sites in South America, particularly Monte Verde in Chile, showed evidence of human occupation dating back 14,500 years. That's older than Clovis. But the archaeological establishment fought this tooth and nail. They didn't want to give up their neat timeline. It took decades of debate, additional excavations and mounting evidence before Monte Verde was finally accepted as legitimate. But even accepting Monte Verde created problems. If people were in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they had to have entered the Americas earlier than that. They needed time to migrate thousands of miles south. So maybe humans arrived 15,000 years ago? 16,000? The timeline kept getting pushed back, but there wasn't solid evidence. Just logical inference. Then came the Oregon discovery, and it changes everything. The site is called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, located in the high desert of eastern Oregon. It's not a glamorous location. No towering cliffs or dramatic landscapes. Just a modest overhang of rock in a region that's been scoured by wind and weather for millennia. The kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance. But to archaeologists, places like this are gold mines. Rock shelters make perfect archaeological sites because they provide natural protection. Material doesn't get washed away by rain. Wind doesn't scatter everything. Layers of sediment build up over time, creating a stratigraphic record. You dig down, you go back in time. Each layer is like a page in a history book. And at Rimrock Draw, the book goes back a lot further than anyone expected. The excavation began in 2022, but the major findings were only announced in late 2025. That's how archaeology works. Years of careful digging, documentation, and analysis before you can say anything definitive. The team was led by Dr. Lauren Davis from Oregon State University, along with researchers from several other institutions. They knew the site was old, but they didn't realize how old until they started getting the radiocarbon dates back. Here's what they found. Stone tools. Lots of them. We're talking about dozens of projectile points, scrapers, and blades. These aren't crude rocks someone banged together. These are carefully crafted tools showing sophisticated stoneworking techniques. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Whoever made these knew what they were doing. But tools alone don't prove anything about age. You need context. You need to date the layers they came from. That's where it gets interesting. The team found charcoal from ancient hearths, campfires basically, in the same layers as the tools, documented exactly where each sample came from, and sent it off for radiocarbon dating. Multiple samples from multiple layers, sent to multiple labs. You don't trust a single date on something this important. You need confirmation. The dates came back. 18,250 years old. Give or take a couple hundred years, which is how radiocarbon dating works. But multiple samples from the same layer all came back with consistent dates. Then they dated samples from layers above and below. Those came back with dates that made sense stratigraphically. Younger material above, older material below. Everything checked out. 18,250 years ago. Humans were in Oregon, making tools and lighting fires more than 18,000 years ago. That's 5,000 years before Clovis. It's even older than Monte Verde, by a significant margin. This isn't just pushing back the timeline. This is demolishing it and forcing a complete rethinking of how and when people got to the Americas. Now, before we go further, let's talk about why this matters so much. This isn't just about dates and bragging rights. This changes our fundamental understanding of human migration, ice age conditions, and the capabilities of ancient peoples. If people were in Oregon 18,000 years ago, they couldn't have come through the ice-free corridor. That corridor didn't open until around 14,000 years ago. Before that, it was blocked by massive glaciers, miles thick, extending from the Arctic Ocean down into what's now the northern United States. Nothing was getting through that. No humans, no animals, nothing. So how did they get here? The answer is becoming increasingly clear. They came by boat along the coast. This is called the Pacific Coastal Migration Theory, and it's been gaining traction for years. The idea is that people didn't march across the interior of a frozen continent, is inland hopping their way from Asia to the Americas. It also would have been rich in food, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, birds, everything you need to sustain a population. The problem with proving the coastal migration theory is that most of the evidence is underwater. Sea levels were 300 feet lower during the Ice Age. The coastline was miles out from where it is today. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, it drowned all those coastal sites. Any camps, tools, or remains are now hundreds of feet below the ocean's surface. That's why we don't have a clear archaeological record of coastal migration. The evidence is submerged, but sites like Rimrock Draw provide indirect evidence. If people were in Oregon 18,000 years ago, they had to get there somehow, and the coastal route is the only option that makes sense. They probably came down the coast, then moved inland following rivers and game trails. The Columbia River drainage system would have been a natural highway into the interior. Now let's talk about what life was like for these people. We're talking about the last glacial maximum, one of the coldest periods in recent Earth history. Ice sheets covered most of Canada. The climate was much harsher than today, but it wasn't uninhabitable. Far from it. The area around Rimrock Draw 18,000 years ago would have been a high desert environment, similar to today, but colder and wetter. More water, more game. An area that remained relatively hospitable while surrounding regions were locked in ice. Animals would have been plentiful. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, camels, horses, all the Pleistocene megafauna. But also smaller game. Rabbits, birds, deer, pronghorn. The archaeological record shows these people weren't just big game hunters. They were eating everything. Fish bones have been found at the site, charred seeds from edible plants. These were sophisticated people with a diverse diet and extensive knowledge of their environment. The stone tools found at Rimrock Draw are particularly interesting. They're not Clovis points. Clovis points have a very distinctive shape, a fluted base where the point attached to the spear shaft. The Rimrock Draw tools are different. They're stemmed points, with a stem or tang at the base. This is an older style, one that predates Clovis by thousands of years. What's fascinating is that similar stemmed points have been found at other early sites across the West. The Paisley Caves in Oregon, also excavated by Dr. Davis's team, had similar tools dating to 14,000 years ago. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho has them dating to over 16,000 years ago. Now Rimrock Draw pushes that back to 18,000 years. A tradition of tool-making that extends across thousands of years and hundreds of miles. This suggests we're not looking at random groups of people stumbling into the Americas by accident, moving through and adapting to different environments. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing harsh conditions. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If people were in Oregon 18,000 years ago, they probably arrived in the Americas even earlier. They needed time to move from wherever they entered, probably Alaska or the Pacific Northwest coast, down to Oregon, 20,000, maybe even 21,000 years ago. And that creates another problem for the old models. Genetic studies of Native American populations have suggested that the founding populations split from East Asian populations somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 years ago. But if they didn't arrive in the Americas until 13,000 years ago, where were they for 7,000 to 12,000 years? Just hanging out in Siberia? That never made sense. But if they arrived 20,000 years ago or more, suddenly the genetics and the archaeology line up. The founding populations split from their Asian ancestors, moved into Beringia, the region including what's now Alaska and eastern Siberia, and then spread into the Americas as opportunities arose. This makes way more sense than the old compressed timeline. There's also the question of what else is out there waiting to be found. Rimrock Draw wasn't discovered by accident. Archaeologists have been surveying the region for decades, looking for early sites. They knew where to look based on geological and environmental factors, places that would have been attractive to ancient peoples. Shelter, game migration routes. How many other sites are out there? The western United States has thousands of rock shelters and caves that haven't been thoroughly investigated. Each one could potentially contain evidence of early occupation. And if we're finding 18,000-year-old sites in Oregon, what might we find further north, closer to the entry point, along the migration routes? The discovery at Rimrock Draw also raises questions about South America. If North America was occupied by 18,000 years ago, what about South America? We know people were at Monteverde in Chile by 14,500 years ago, but that's the southern tip of the continent, thousands of miles from where they entered. If the timeline in North America is being pushed back, shouldn't we expect South American dates to go back further too? Some researchers think we should be looking for 20,000-year-old sites in South America, maybe older. The continent is huge and most of it hasn't been systematically surveyed for early sites. We're probably only scratching the surface of how long people have been here. Now let's talk about the implications for Native American communities. This isn't just academic archaeology. These are the ancestors of living peoples. Many Native American tribes have oral traditions about being in their territories since time immemorial. Western science has often dismissed these traditions as mythology, but as the archaeological timeline gets pushed further and further back, those traditions look more and more accurate. The discovery at Rimrock Draw was made with the cooperation and involvement of local tribes. The Burns Paiute tribe and other regional tribes were consulted throughout the excavation process. This is how modern archaeology should work. These aren't just artifacts to be studied. They're part of living cultural heritage. Many tribes see these discoveries as validation of what they've always known. Their people have been here for thousands of generations. They didn't migrate here from somewhere else recently. This is their homeland, and the archaeology increasingly supports that. But there's also a darker side to these discoveries. For centuries, the idea that Native Americans were relatively recent arrivals in the Americas was used to justify colonization. If they'd only been here a few thousand years, the logic went, they hadn't really established permanent ownership of the land. Europeans could claim it without much moral concern. This was always a bogus argument, but it was used nevertheless. As we discover that Native Americans have been here for 18,000 years or more, far longer than Europeans have been in Europe as distinct peoples, that argument becomes even more ridiculous. These are the indigenous people of the Americas in the deepest sense of the word. They've been here longer than most modern ethnic groups have existed anywhere. The Rimrock Draw discovery also highlights how much we still don't know about Ice Age America. The continent wasn't empty. It wasn't a frozen wasteland. People were here, living complex lives, developing distinct cultures, adapting to diverse environments. We're only beginning to understand what that world was like. Think about what 18,000 years means. That's 900 generations. That's long enough for languages to diverge completely, for cultures to develop entirely different worldviews, for populations to adapt physically to their environments. The diversity of Native American cultures we see today, from Arctic hunters to desert farmers to coastal fishermen, that diversity developed over thousands and thousands of years. And we're finding evidence that this diversity existed deep in the past too. The stemmed points from Rimrock Draw are different from other tool traditions. The subsistence strategies varied by region. The coastal peoples had different lifestyles from interior peoples. This wasn't a monolithic migration of identical people. This was a complex, multifaceted human expansion into new territories. One of the most exciting aspects of the Rimrock Draw discovery is what it suggests about future finds. If we're finding sites this old in Oregon, a region that's been relatively well studied, what might we find in less explored areas? What about the Great Basin, the Columbia Plateau, the California coast? Each of these regions has potential for harboring early sites. We're getting better at finding and excavating submerged sites. The coastline from 18,000 years ago is underwater now. But it's not impossible to reach, just difficult and expensive. As funding increases and methods improve, We're going to start finding coastal sites. When that happens, the whole picture is going to change again. There's also the question of the Bering Land Bridge itself. Beringia. This was a massive area, bigger than Texas, that connected Asia and North America. It wasn't just a bridge people hurried across. It was a homeland. People lived there for thousands of years. We have very limited archaeology from Beringia, because most of it is underwater now too. But the sites we have found suggest it was occupied long before people moved south into the rest of the Americas. Some researchers think Beringia was a refugium during the last glacial maximum. Then, as conditions improved and ice retreated, people expanded from Beringia into both Asia and the Americas. This would make Beringia not just a corridor, but a crucial homeland for multiple populations. The genetic evidence supports this to some degree. Native American populations show genetic signatures suggesting they went through a population bottleneck, a period when the population was small and isolated. This could have happened in Beringia. A founding population, maybe just a few hundred people, lived in isolation for thousands of years, and possibly faster. If people were in Oregon by 18,000 years ago, they moved through Alaska, Canada, and down the coast or into the interior pretty quickly. That suggests these were highly mobile, highly capable people, not struggling survivors but successful colonizers. Let's talk about the scientific process behind a discovery like this. When you find something that challenges established thinking, the burden of proof is enormous. You can't just announce that you found 18,000-year-old tools and expect everyone to believe you. You need airtight evidence. That's why the Rimrock Draw team was so careful. Multiple radiocarbon dates from multiple labs. Stratigraphic analysis showing the layers haven't been disturbed. Detailed documentation of every artifact's position. Peer review by other experts. Publication in major scientific journals. This isn't some fringe theory promoted by amateur enthusiasts. This is rigorous science conducted by respected researchers using established methods, and the broader archaeological community is taking it seriously. Of course, some researchers want more evidence. Some think the dates might be slightly off. But nobody's dismissing it out of hand, the way Monteverdi was dismissed in the 1970s. The tide has turned. The archaeological community now accepts that the peopling of the Americas was earlier and more complex than previously thought. This represents a major shift in scientific thinking. It's relatively rare for an entire field to overturn its fundamental paradigm. But that's what's happening in American archaeology. The Clovis first model dominated for half a century. Now it's dead. We're in a new era of understanding, and discoveries like Rimrock Draw are leading the way. What's next? More excavations. Obviously, the Rimrock Draw site isn't fully excavated yet. Each layer could potentially push the dates back further, and there are hundreds of other potential sites across the West that need investigation. We're also going to see more interdisciplinary work. Geneticists, climatologists, geologists, and archaeologists working together to build a complete picture. What was the climate like? What routes were available? What do genetics tell us about population movements? How do we reconcile different lines of evidence? This kind of collaborative science is producing the best results. The peopling of the Americas is one of the great stories of human achievement. Colonized 2 entire continents. They adapted to every climate zone from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. They developed hundreds of distinct cultures and languages. They built civilizations. And they did it all thousands of years earlier than we thought. Rimrock Draw is another chapter in that story. People sat around a fire in an Oregon rock shelter, making tools, cooking food, living their lives. They had no idea they were part of one of humanity's greatest expansions. They were just surviving, thriving, making a home in a new land. And now, after all those millennia, we're finding their traces and beginning to understand their story. Thanks for watching. If you want more archaeology and ancient history deep dives, make sure to subscribe. More discoveries are coming, and we'll be covering them all.